What's up, everyone? We're back for, I don't know, maybe this qualifies as an emergency podcast. Wes Matthews is back. Wes Matthews is back in Milwaukee. We've got weekend roster movement. I missed one podcast during the week, and I say, well, we're going to catch up. We've already had the podcast with Lisa Byington, but now we need to do an emergency podcast. There is roster moves. We need to break it down. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Bucks. I'm your host, Kane Pittman. You can see and hear me on this show daily and also find my work over at ESPN. And joining me is the founder of brewhoop.com and longtime voice of the podcast, Frank Madden, who, look at him. Look at the background. This man is in the office right now. It's Friday night.
I got green though, so it works.
But it's not quite Bucks green, is it? No.
It's a little too light for that.
But anyway, the point is Frank's pulling double duty on a Friday night. What a man! What a guy! We are here to podcast about the Bucks making some roster moves. As always, we thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen of every single day. And I want to commiserate with our Greek friends. First of all, Georgios Kalaitzakis has been waived. And the reason I say that is I've been there before, guys. Listen, when you've
been waived by the Milwaukee Bucks as well, so you know what he's feeling right now.
I've been waived by the Milwaukee Bucks. There's no doubt about that. But I was in Milwaukee when Daly got traded, when Thon Maker got traded. So when you are from an international country, you just want these guys to do well. You want them to succeed. And when they're playing for the Bucks, it's obviously an added piece of fun. So I mean that seriously. There'll probably be some Greek fans that wish that things worked out differently. But Wes Matthews is back. These these transactions were announced in very quick succession, which obviously makes sense. But Frank, what were you thinking as this went down?
Well, I saw Shams tweeted out the news that Georgios was being waived, and my first reaction was, okay, free up the open roster, free up an open roster spot again, get you back to the point where you were pre-Boogie signing, so you've got 14 guys and you can add another one. I didn't necessarily expect that they were immediately going to add another player, but I mean, look, Georgios, I had to double check. He was basically half guaranteed this year, $462,000. So. Look, I mean, I think most of us didn't really understand from a basketball perspective, like what he was doing with an NBA roster spot at this point. We've talked about sort of the incongruity between, Mamu being on a two-way and Georgios having a proper NBA roster spot. Technically, because Georgios was bought out, he was not eligible for a two-way spot. But even so, it's just, he was not a guy that was on really anybody's, or at least, when you talk to draft people, he wasn't really a guy that seemed to be on anybody's radar as far as being an NBA draft pick. Obviously there's the connections with Giannis's agent, all that stuff. So
he wasn't going to play, Frank.
He wasn't going to play this year. Exactly. He wasn't going to play this year. He wasn't going to contribute. Maybe there's some version of the world where eventually he could have been some fringe player, but obviously he's not going to help you win an NBA championship this year. And, on a roster where you now have obviously Brook Lopez lost to long-term injury, we'll see, fingers crossed, that, when he might be able to come back later this year. Dante obviously is still a ways out. And then, you look at the other wings, which I think leads into the discussion of Wes Matthews' return. Look at the other guys who are nominally in that wing rotation right now. Semi Ojeleye, had been sort of the nominal hope of being the Shemi. I was going to say semi replacement for PJ Tucker, but pun not intended. He's obviously has been, let's say, inconsistent to say the least, and now is out for probably a couple more weeks. And then Rodney Hood and Jordan Wara are, having a fight over the keys to Bud's doghouse, it seems, with just the way that they've been really struggling to kind of make an impact. So, I think to me it makes sense. I mean, we were talking about it beforehand, like as a Bucks fan who wants to see them try to make a title run, how do I feel about swapping Georgios for Wes Matthews? And again, Wes was not on an NBA roster. He's 35 years old. He obviously didn't have a great year with the Lakers last year. There are reasons why he was not employed currently, but in the grand scheme of, does this give the Bucks, a better chance of being competitive this season? I would say yes. Happily take it from that perspective. So obviously now the big question is, what does Wes Matthews have left?
My goodness.
And yeah, I know. And how does that fit into what the Bucks do the rest of the season? I think probably some of the same things that we've said about Boogie apply to Wes. Big difference being that there's obviously not, a huge hole on the wing in the same way that there is at center right now. But I think he absolutely has a chance to win some rotation minutes, just because we're seeing Bud's playing eight guys, 9 guys each night, and he's obviously not getting a whole lot of production from some of those backup wings. And to me, the most interesting thing about Wes, and we saw it when he was here last time, he's a really physical and versatile wing defender, and they really don't have guys at the wing short of like Giannis who can kind of cope with more physical kind of power wings, right? I mean, we've seen the way Wes would be the guy that would defend Kawhi, Jimmy Butler, even LeBron, and again, he has limitations, and he's gotten older since we last saw him do that. But he has a physicality and a toughness that, again, as much as a guy like Pat Connaughton and Grayson Allen, they are better NBA players than Wes Matthews for sure. But Wes Matthews is a different type of player, and I think the question is, does adding that type of physical wing, does that give you a dimension? Does that let you do some things in terms of two-way play, especially I think defensively, that maybe you couldn't with the way the roster was previously constructed?
I'm just, as you were saying that, I'm trying to scroll through. I can't find this DM. I mentioned this to you before we started recording. There is a Bucks fan, I assume a listener of the show, but if they are, please reach out and remind me who it was, because I can't find this DM. But going back a couple of weeks ago, I had a DM saying, "What do you think about Wes Matthews? What's Wes Matthews up to?" And I think I responded something along the lines of, "I literally haven't heard anything about him. He looked not great last year in LA. Is he done? I'm not 100% sure. But I think the point that you made, like ultimately, if you're looking at this and saying, well, okay, well, Yorgos was literally never going to play. And now you get a guy that only 18 months ago, roughly 18 months ago, we were on this podcast wondering, why the hell isn't Wes Matthews playing minutes in the playoffs? So to me, when I look at Wes, and you spoke about some of the defensive jobs that he had, it was so soon between that season and the next season starting with LA that it's like, okay, was this situational? Has this guy still got some gas left in the tank? We'll see. I don't know. But I think we've spoken at length about what Giannis can do for a guy like that, particularly on the offensive end. Stand out there, knock down those threes. You can pull the bow and arrow out. I'm looking forward to seeing that celebration again. There's no doubt about that. I'm also looking forward to seeing this tag team duo reuniting, Giannis and Wes Matthews, in one of the coolest photos of all time with the tag team championship belts, as we've got up here on the screen. But when we think back to that postseason series against Miami, and part of the problem was that once Giannis was injured and the Bucks offense was completely bogged down, Wes isn't a guy that's going to give you any offensive versatility, but that wasn't his value to the team. So when you look at the guys that they have on the roster now, and Pat's can do more, he can put the ball on the floor and he's scoring more at the rim. You've got Grayson Allen out there. It does at least say, pique my curiosity to see how he can fit in some of these lineups if he is a guy that you can use as a defensive player that can guard anywhere from 2 right up to 4.
And most importantly, unlike the last time he was in a Bucks uniform, you have Drew Holiday instead of Eric Bledsoe, right?
Yeah, well,
Which was obviously, the really shone a light on Wes's limitations when he wasn't just doing kind of catch and shoot threes. So yeah, and we were talking about it before the pod. I mean, to me, I think the Bucks right now at sort of this sort of crossroads where they have this sort of broad challenge where you think about, how do they win an NBA championship? Well, to me, a big part of the story was, I mean, putting aside like Giannis being incredible and Middleton hitting clutch shots and all that, they had the best defense of any team in last year's playoffs. That is how really, to me, they won that championship. And to me, they had a really important combination in that they could play very big. You've got Brooke, you've got Giannis, and you also have like Drew Holiday and PJ Tucker who play big and physical for the positions that they guard. And so they could play very big and physical and beat you up on both sides. The rebounding was a huge part of the story last year. But then with PJ, he was a really critical piece because obviously you could put Giannis at the 5, you put PJ out there at, call it the 4, but, sometimes he's guarding Devin Booker or whatever it is, not necessarily always guarding 4s, but, you had PJ and then you had obviously the rest of the kind of core guys. Pat was often obviously a key part. Drew and Chris goes without saying. But you were able to play small, right, with Giannis at the 5, quote unquote small, but you didn't really give up as much physicality as normally you would. You basically gained a lot of like switchability and malleability, but you didn't really lose the physicality and our ability to kind of hold your own on the glass. And I think that's really when I think about the Bucks, what worries me right now about the Bucks more broadly. And again, not to say Wes Matthews or DeMarcus Cousins solve these problems, but I think that's kind of the point of where I'm at when I look at this team. You take Brook out of the equation, well, then suddenly you can't be that monster team that just crushes you on the boards and takes away everything at the rim. Giannis can paper over a lot, but he can't get you to, the heights of what they're capable of with Brook Lopez. Likewise, PJ Tucker's been out of the equation, obviously, since training camp when he left to go to Miami. And so that's another important piece where, I think the thesis has been more about, well, we're going to lean more into offense. If Grayson Allen and Dante DiVincenzo are out there taking PJ Tucker's minutes, yes, you're not going to be as suffocating defensively, but you're going to have a whole lot more skill offensively and maybe make it up for it that way. But I think there's still the question of, certain matchups. Do you have enough size, physicality, especially on the wing, to be able to play some of those different lineups? And so the thing that really, aside from just, the possibility of obviously not having Brook for a lot of the regular season and potentially the playoffs, that's obviously, you worry about that just because of what he means to your team. But it also kind of worried me because I started thinking like, well, geez, I thought the Bucks' big problem was just that they had to solve for kind of the PJ replacement and what is sort of the small lineup. Do they find a rhythm in a different sort of configuration, which again, they could. They don't necessarily need an exact PJ Tucker clone. But now it's like, oh, now you don't have Brook either. Okay, hopefully Brook comes back. But if you don't, then, is your trade deadline trying to figure out a Brook Lopez replacement, right? Trying to figure out, replacements for Brook Lopez and PJ Tucker. That's a whole lot. And again, that's the thing that kind of would have scared me the most. So neither DeMarcus Cousins nor Wes Matthews are obviously filling, those gaps that the Bucks have right now with Brook injured and PJ gone. But I do think, from like a rotation perspective, it's a huge opportunity for both those guys to prove that they can still play at a rotation caliber level in the NBA. And again, it would make me a bit nervous, like the idea that now those guys are going to need to be rotation players in the playoffs, just from what we've seen, especially Boogie previously in last year's playoffs. But, we'll wait and see. I think Brook, you obviously just hope he comes back later in the regular season and at least that part gets solved for you. But I think Wes is really interesting because, again, with the fact that kind of that, non-Pat Connaughton wing off the bench, like nobody has distinguished themselves. I think there is an opportunity for Wes to kind of come in and be a guy that can eat innings, especially when you're playing those really kind of, tough sort of power wing type guys that, again, maybe a bit challenging for someone like Pat to play against. And again, Pat doesn't, I would say Pat doesn't, or Wes doesn't scale up to defend like 4s and 5s the way like a PJ Tucker can. That's what makes PJ really unique in that like he literally can guard 1 through 5 pretty competently. Wes isn't quite that. But I mean, we've seen him like in his year with the Bucks. The years before that, people would talk about him being washed and, he didn't really have it anymore. Came to Milwaukee. I mean, he was a very non-trivial part of that defense being the best it's been in the Bud era. They were incredible with him on the floor defensively when he was there. And, I'm not saying they regressed last year just because Wes Matthews left, but I do think there's something hopefully that he might still be able to bring, provided he's close to the guy that he was the last time we saw him in Milwaukee.
Well, I can wrap my head around the idea of why this signing makes sense for the reason that you just pointed to. If he has something left in the tank, and it's a big if, but we spoke about the fact he was defending Kawhi, he was defending LeBron, he was the guy. And what that does, and we saw this last year, and it's not disrespecting what PJ Tucker did. He was absolutely fantastic, particularly in that series against Brooklyn. But Kevin Durant was still scoring 45 points a night. But what it did allow you to do was Chris Middleton didn't have to defend him. And they were looking for that guy. And it's not that So if West has something in the tank, you can probably assume if he was still around and they were in that series, he would be the guy getting that role. And then you don't have to worry about Chris doing that. We spoke about Pat doing it in stretches as well. So anyway, that's, congratulations to Wes. If you've got anything left in the tank, you've signed yourself up for the Kevin Durant assignment. So congratulations for that, Wes. I guess the other question that came through on Twitter, Frank, that's worth at least bringing it up, and it's speculative at the moment, there's no doubt about that, but there are a bunch of guys that you sort of mentioned too that are kind of just not really in the rotation, haven't necessarily impressed to start the season. And of course, there's a guy like Dante who's been a huge part in the past, but we don't really know when he's coming back either. So when you talk about the fact that the Bucks still need probably a big, although I would like to have a big if DeMarcus Cousins, depending on what happens there, the guy everyone keeps asking about is Robin Lopez, who I believe his contract is around $5 million. This was one of the things that we spoke about the other day. It's never good to go in for back surgery, but as far as the Bucks season projects going forward, having 2 months before the trade deadline is nice to see what you got in Boogie, see what you got in Wes Matthews. Is Dante going to come back to return? It gives you a little bit of a breathing space here to work things out before the trade deadline. And you mentioned a bunch of guys that theoretically would have some value around the league, particularly potentially to a team like Orlando that does want some young players and they're trying to build something there. If this works out, does this change anything in your mind in regards to potential trade scenarios, packages, what you could do to get a guy, for example, like Robin? Let's be honest, they're bringing the band back together. They got George Hill, they got Wes. Robin, come on down.
Yeah, Ursan, honorary assistant coach or something. Where's DJ Wilson these days? I don't think DJ Wilson is not on a roster spot, right? So yeah, we can play the whole get the band back together thing. I will say too, I mean, I try not to be overly sentimental about this stuff, but as a Bucks fan who really, I mean, look, the first couple years of the Bud era, that was by far the best regular season basketball I've ever seen as a Bucks fan. And, it was a really likable group. You joke about Wes and the, pregame wrestling and all that kind of stuff. I mean, those are really fun teams. I think Wes is generally a likable guy. I mean, he's from the state of Wisconsin, right? There was always that kind of local angle. Marquette guy that, always sort of just added an extra likability factor to him. Marquette and Wisconsin, I think, are playing maybe tonight. Oh. I don't really have a dog in that fight. I know you don't either, Kane. So, that's the one thing that Wisconsin sports fans don't always kind of align on. So, but I would say it's cool to anytime you can get guys that played in the state or from the state. But I think it's a cool storyline. It's very similar to George Hill, where it felt like George Hill wasn't happy going out the way he did. He was pretty vocal about it. I don't think Wes necessarily really said anything kind of bad on the way out, but I think him being benched in some of those fourth quarters against the Heat, as you mentioned, I'm sure that him going to the Lakers, that wasn't sort of at least somewhat on his mind. And so I think, again, it's cool that we get to have kind of the reunion vibes. And, obviously I'd love to see the Bucks win a championship regardless of, who roster spots 12 through 15 go to. But it adds kind of another little dimension here. I mean, it would be really cool if you were able to repeat, to do it, get rings for a couple guys like Wes and George that were part of rebuilding this team and getting it back to this really high level. And were guys that, by all accounts were well liked in the locker room, and being able to do it with them this year as well. So yeah, I mean, they're at 15 roster spots now. So we'll see kind of what happens from here on out. I will say one thing we didn't talk about the other day. So I think a couple of people I saw brought up the idea of getting a disabled player exception for Brook. Again, this is something that you can get from the league if a player is expected to be out for the season. I believe I was looking at it a little bit, like you have to apply for this by January 15th. So I don't expect anything imminent around that. If you do get a DPE awarded to you by the league, you get a salary spot for the lesser of essentially half the guy's salary, which in Brook's case would be a little over $6 million, almost $7 million, or up to the mid-level. But given this case, it'd be something south of $7 million on a prorated basis. So again, I don't think anything's going to happen. I mean, I talked about watching what the Bucks do from a transactional standpoint as an indicator of what really is going on with Brook Lopez. obviously if they apply for a DPE on early January or something, that would tell you that things are not progressing the way they might want. Now, also should be noted, you don't get an extra roster spot for that disabled player exception. So they would have to move somebody currently on the roster in order to use that on somebody else. It's also can be used like a trade exception if a guy is in his final year. So for instance, if Brook was out for the year, you applied for that. If you get it, you could use that to absorb Robin Lopez on his contract, just as, an illustration, right? I don't know if the Bucks are, if he would be the first guy they'd want, but, they know him. Clearly the Bucks like reunions. So, who would be, I can't think of anybody more fun to bring back in the event of an unfortunate Brooks situation than his brother. So, just a kind of just a side note on that. Obviously there would be major tax implications from just adding a $5 million salary to this team. I don't give a shit about that, right? Like, sure, pay $25 million net or whatever it might be. It wouldn't be for the full season, but hey, whatever. There would be a lot of cost to do something like that, but that could be an option. And at the end of the day, too, like, we don't know, right? Like, is Robin Lopez going to be traded? Is he going to be bought out after the trade deadline if they can't get something for him? Who knows, right? This is all sort of speculation at this point. So again, as much as I love Robin, hopefully you won't need him and Brook just comes back. But yeah, there's just a lot of variables right now, unfortunately, for the Bucks with these injuries and the fact that we don't know exactly who's going to be around later in the season, and with not having seen Dante at this point. But I think as far as like short-term flyers go with veterans that you at least kind of know how they'd fit in and what they can do. Sure, let's let it ride with Wes Matthews. Let's see what he can do. I think he does fit kind of a nominal need that they have. And now obviously the question is like, can he really deliver on that? Can he still play at a high enough level to actually justify and actually help you, not just in the regular season, but, can he actually paper out to be somebody that you'd actually want to play some number of minutes in the playoffs? That's obviously a big question.
All right. Have we got anything else to add here, Frank, do you think, from the Wes Matthews, Georgios Kalaitzakis transaction Friday evening? News breaking.
I thought it was interesting. I was looking at Wes's numbers, and it's kind of funny. I mentioned, his sort of on-off numbers were like bad in the years leading up to his year in Milwaukee, and then last year he definitely. His numbers generally got a bit worse in LA last year. Again, he didn't fall off the face of the earth. They were like 0.3 points per possession worse defensively last year in LA with him on the floor, which when you consider that was a very good defensive team, I would suggest that, it's not like he's suddenly become a bad defensive player. But yeah, obviously he has some offensive limitations. But the flip side is like after watching PJ last year, right? Like, we know the Bucks can get by with a guy on offense who doesn't do a whole lot. But by the same token, that player obviously also has to contribute a lot defensively. Thankfully, Wes is not being asked to go back to being a starter, but look, again, I think he's kind of an underrated part of the story of those first couple Bud years, just coming in and being part of still that starting lineup. That starting lineup put up by far the best numbers of any of the starting lineups that the Bucks have had during the Bud era. So we'll see. You just hope that maybe they can kind of recapture some of that, and kind of like with George Hill, for some reason, something's in the water when George Hill got to Milwaukee and, playing a Bud system. You just hope that maybe you can kind of recapture some of that with Wes Matthews as well. By the way, I am really struggling to say Wes Matthews without like flubbing it. Apparently I just have some weird inability to do that, even though I had to say his name constantly 2 years ago. So that's my big area of improvement here that I need to work on over this weekend, I think.
Back-to-back podcasts. Been a while since we've had to discuss. See, now I can't talk. It's been a while since we've had to discuss Wes, so it's fine. We'll work our way back into it. There's no dramas there. Should we leave it there? You get on with your Friday night. I'll get on with my Saturday. That sounds like a plan. By the way, depending on when you're listening to this podcast, if you haven't already caught the conversation with Lisa Byington, make sure you go and check that out. It was a really fun pod. Me and Frank were with Lisa. We said it was going to be 30 minutes. It ended up being close to 40. You guys know how we roll. That's just that's the way these things go. But Lisa was awesome, as we knew she would be. So make sure you check out that podcast sometime over the weekend or whenever you're listening to that. But we'll wrap it there. The Bucks have a game with the Heat coming up here. We'll be back for a post-game pod at some stage there.
By the way, Giannis right now is on the injury report as doubtful with that sore right calf, which not ideal. So yeah, Wes Matthews, why don't you just show up and be a Giannis replacement tomorrow? How about that?
Yeah, that seems fine. I think he'll be up to the challenge. There should be no problem there.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? But we'll be back to break down that game at some point as well. We'll leave it there for Frank and myself. Enjoy the weekend, people. We'll speak to you guys next time.